Why Venetian night watchers carried unlit lanterns. The city of Venice in the late medieval and early modern period presents an unusual blend of water, stone, and human ingenuity. You can imagine yourself standing on one of the narrow bridges that cross a canal at night centuries ago. The water is quiet, carrying the faint creak of a gondola's oar. Buildings lean inward, their plaster faded, their shutters closed against the damp air. Yet the city was not empty. Among the alleys and waterways moved the Serenissimi Guardiani di Notte, the night watchmen of Venice. Their presence was expected, but what drew the curiosity of many visitors was their peculiar custom. They carried lanterns, yes, but often those lanterns remained unlit. To understand why, you need to first understand Venice itself. By the 15th and 16th centuries, the city was a commercial giant, thriving on trade that connected the East and West. Its wealth made it a target, not only for foreign rivals but also for thieves within its own walls. A city of narrow streets, blind alleys, and endless waterways required vigilance. Fires posed an enormous risk, for even though the city sat on water, its houses were built from timber beams and tightly packed against one another. A single candle left unattended might ignite a roof, and flames could leap across canals with surprising ease. Venetians did not leave safety to chance. The Republic developed a structured system of night patrols. Watchmen walked in pairs, wearing distinctive cloaks or badges to mark their authority. They were tasked with preventing crime, detecting fires, and ensuring that the citizens of Venice slept in relative peace. They carried lanterns with them, yet most accounts suggest that these lanterns were often left unlit, an oddity that has puzzled historians and visitors alike. Why carry a light that you never use? One explanation lies in the design of Venetian streets. Unlike many cities of the time, Venice was not in complete darkness. Reflections from the moon and starlight, bouncing off canals and pale stone, offered a faint glow that allowed those accustomed to the city to move confidently even at night. To light a lantern unnecessarily would not only ruin one's natural night vision, but also make a watchman more visible to wrongdoers. You can picture a thief slipping into a shadow, waiting as a bright lantern announced the approach of authority long before the watchman arrived. An unlit lantern offered silence and surprise, tools just as valuable as the heavy staves they carried. But the lanterns were not merely props. They served as symbols of authority. In an emergency, a watchman could strike flint, light his lantern, and signal to others. The glow of a lantern in the dark Venetian night meant something was happening. An arrest, a fire, or a disturbance. It was a visual cue to citizens who might peek from their shutters. Carrying an unlit lantern, therefore, was a constant reminder of readiness. Another practical reason was tied to fire prevention itself. Open flames in a city already vulnerable to fires were carefully controlled. Lighting a lantern required oil and wick, both valuable, and risked setting clothing or wooden structures alight if handled carelessly. By keeping the lanterns unlit, watchmen reduced the hazards of their own tools. A lantern could be used when needed but did not threaten the very safety they were sworn to protect. Daily routines for these watchmen were monotonous but essential. Their patrols were organized by districts or sestieri. Each watchman knew the alleys and canals of his beat intimately. The rhythm of their duties was slow. They checked doorways, paused at corners, and listened for noises that might suggest unrest. In some accounts, watchmen were required to call out the hour as they passed, their voices echoing off the stone walls. For the sleepless citizen, hearing the third hour of the night, called in a steady tone, could bring reassurance. For the weary watchman, it was a ritual that broke the monotony of walking the same route again and again. Records show that the Venetian Republic enforced strict rules for the conduct of its night guards. They were expected to avoid drinking on duty, to carry their lanterns and staves at all times, and to report directly to the magistrates if any incident occurred. Penalties for negligence were severe. Fines were imposed on those who fell asleep at their posts, and dismissal could follow repeated offenses. It was not a glamorous role, but in a city dependent on order, it was vital. Beyond the routine, you might wonder about the men themselves, who became a Venetian night watcher. They were often drawn from the lower classes, men who needed steady employment in a city where opportunities were unevenly distributed. Some were ex-sailors accustomed to harsh conditions. Others were older men unable to labor on the docks but still capable of walking long hours. Pay was modest, but the job carried a degree of respect, especially in neighborhoods where personal ties made the presence of a watchman reassuring. Historical documents occasionally reveal small glimpses into their lives. In one report from the 16th century, a pair of watchmen apprehended a thief attempting to steal from a gondola laden with goods. The thief claimed he mistook the boat for his own, a defense so weak that the magistrates mocked it in their records. Another case describes watchmen intervening in a domestic quarrel that spilled into the street, their presence preventing further violence. These were not grand events, but they kept the delicate balance of order in a city where disorder could spread quickly. The unlit lantern remains central to their role, a strange but symbolic accessory. To modern readers, it may appear useless, yet in Venice it represented potential. It was an instrument of signal, a mark of authority, and a tool to be used sparingly in a city that valued both discretion and safety. In a sense, the unlit lantern mirrored the very nature of their work. Quiet, understated, always present but rarely the focus of attention. Think for a moment about the sensory details of that night patrol. The dampness of the air as it clung to your cloak, the uneven stones beneath your boots, the faint lap of water against the foundations of houses. Every so often, the echo of laughter from a tavern, muffled behind wooden doors, and in your hand, the weight of a lantern, glass cool against your fingers, wick unlit. You walked not to be seen but to see. The city rested, trusting you to notice what they could not. The question that lingers, however, is whether the lantern's unlit state was a matter of efficiency, safety, or symbolism above all. Was it more important as a tool for sudden need, as a warning light only in crisis? Or did its very presence, dangling from the hand of a watchman, carry enough meaning without flame? As you continue to imagine the Venetian night, the figure of the watchman becomes clearer. His role was not just about walking streets, but about embodying the constant vigilance of the Republic itself. The Venetian government was unique, shaped by a system of councils, magistrates, and secret committees that prized stability above all else. Night watchmen fit into this structure as part of the machinery that kept order, a small cog but an essential one. You might picture him stopping beneath an archway, listening for the sound of movement. In Venice, narrow passageways created strange echoes. The bark of a dog could sound like a shout. The closing of a shutter might mimic footsteps. The watchman's task was to discern what mattered from what did not. He did not carry complex weapons. Instead, he carried his staff, a symbol of authority and a tool for defense if needed. In one hand was the lantern, unlit but ready. His senses were his most valuable assets. The lantern remained an object of fascination, but its practical role was tied to the rhythm of patrols. Venetian nights could be unpredictable. Sudden fog might roll in from the lagoon, swallowing sound and sight. In such conditions, an unlit lantern was no hindrance. Light would only reflect back against the mist. Yet if danger arose, the watchman could strike it alight, its glow piercing the haze enough to signal others. Some accounts even suggest that multiple lanterns, lit at once, created chains of light that guided citizens during emergencies. It was not constant use but selective, almost ritualistic. The decision not to light lanterns casually also reflected the Republic's concern with discretion. Venetian politics were notorious for secrecy. Councils deliberated behind closed doors, and citizens were encouraged to report suspicious activities anonymously through lions' mouths, carved stone boxes that collected denunciations. In such a culture, the night watch mirrored the state's values: to observe quietly, to intervene without drawing more attention than necessary, and to remind people that order was being maintained even when invisible. Daily routines included more than walking. Watchmen were also responsible for checking fire prevention measures. They ensured that taverns extinguished their braziers properly at closing time, that residents did not leave candles burning near wooden shutters, and that gondoliers tied their boats securely to avoid accidents that might cause property damage. Fires were rare compared to other European cities, thanks to strict regulation, but the fear of one never left Venetian minds. Every ember was a potential disaster in a city where water was plentiful but access for firefighters was slow and awkward. The records of the Venetian Senate and the criminal courts provide a steady picture of these duties. Reports submitted by watch captains described the state of neighborhoods each night. They noted disturbances, small thefts, drunken arguments, or the presence of strangers. The unlit lantern was almost always mentioned as a required piece of equipment, a detail repeated so often that it seems ordinary. Yet it became a symbol of reliability, a simple item that meant the watchman was prepared to react if necessary. Visitors to Venice often commented on the quiet efficiency of these men. Travelers from Northern Europe, where lanterns were commonly lit on patrols, found it curious to see watchmen carrying darkened lights. Some interpreted it as laziness, assuming the guards were too careless to strike them. Others, more observant, noted how the darkness made the men nearly invisible until they were close, allowing them to observe without alerting anyone. In a city where intrigue was constant, that invisibility was valuable. The psychology of the watchman's job cannot be ignored. Walking hour after hour through silent streets required patience. The mind could wander, lulled by routine, yet vigilance was demanded. Many watchmen developed habits to stay alert. Some hummed softly to themselves, others tapped their staves against stones at intervals. Calling out the hours was not only for citizens but also for themselves, a way to break the monotony. The second hour of night was as much reassurance to the caller as it was to the listener. Payment for such duties was modest but steady. Unlike merchants or sailors, whose incomes rose and fell with trade, watchmen received fixed wages from the Republic. This provided a rare form of stability in a city where fortunes could collapse overnight. Some men held the role for decades, their presence becoming familiar to residents of their districts. In small communities, trust was built over years. The sight of the same man passing each night, lantern in hand, became part of the fabric of Venetian life. One cannot separate the night watch from Venice's wider system of control. The city was not democratic in the modern sense but operated through careful balances of power. The Council of Ten, one of the most feared governing bodies, oversaw matters of security with ruthless attention. Watchmen were their eyes and ears in the streets. Reports of unusual gatherings, foreigners acting suspiciously, or citizens out past curfew could end up in the council's archives. In this way, even the most uneventful patrol contributed to the Republic's broader obsession with stability. The watchmen themselves, though ordinary, became part of Venice's identity. They were mentioned in chronicles, in diaries, and even in literature. Some Venetian comedies of the 17th century mocked them as bumbling or overly cautious, but even such mockery suggested their ubiquity. A night in Venice without the steady presence of these cloaked figures would have been unimaginable. Their unlit lanterns, dangling at their sides, were visual shorthand for the city at rest. In practical terms, the lantern was often made of simple materials: metal frame, glass panels, and an oil wick inside. Kept unlit, it was light enough to carry without effort. When lit, it could burn for several hours, though the oil had to be rationed carefully. Too much use meant unnecessary expense, and the Republic was cautious with public funds. Even small economies mattered when multiplied across the dozens of watchmen who patrolled each night. Consider again the symbolism of carrying a lantern not for light but for presence. It was both a reassurance and a warning. To citizens who glimpsed it, it meant safety. To thieves or wrongdoers, it meant danger. To the watchman himself, it was a reminder of his responsibility. In the quiet of a Venetian night, where the only sound might be water lapping against stone, the weight of that object carried meaning beyond its simple function. The mystery, then, is not so much why the lantern was unlit but why it had to be carried at all. Why insist on a tool rarely used? Was it habit, law, or the human need for symbols of order? Perhaps the Republic understood that authority is not only exercised but displayed, even in silence. An unlit lantern was less about illumination and more about signaling a readiness that needed no words. The question remains whether the watchmen themselves thought of it in this way. Did they regard their lanterns as burdens, tools, or badges of office? Did they feel their significance? Or were they simply practical objects they carried because rules demanded it? The silence of the sources leaves us without a clear answer. We are left with the image of a man walking the narrow streets of Venice, carrying a darkened light, trusted by a city that prized discretion above spectacle. The story of Venetian night watchers cannot end without considering how their work shaped not only daily life but also the way the Republic itself projected power. Night patrols were more than security. They were living symbols of order, discipline, and continuity. Every evening, when citizens locked their shutters and settled into bed, the city came alive in another rhythm. The presence of watchmen was a quiet reassurance that even in darkness, Venice remained in control. In most European cities, the night belonged to uncertainty. Streets were largely abandoned, except for taverns, thieves, and wanderers. Fires spread quickly, and violence was common. Venice was different. Its reliance on canals, the absence of horses and wagons in most streets, and its unique geography made it quieter, more contained. The unlit lanterns, carried by pairs of watchmen, became part of that distinctive rhythm. The decision not to use light casually contributed to a city where night was not chaos but something closer to managed silence. The effect on daily life was subtle but important. Venetian merchants often stored goods in warehouses near the canals. Without the watchmen, these goods would have been vulnerable to theft. Gondoliers who worked late into the night knew that patrols kept order on the waterways. Residents trusted that if a disturbance broke out, someone would be near to intervene. In return, the Republic's system of surveillance extended even into people's sleep. Citizens were watched not only during the day but also at night. The unlit lantern became a metaphor for this surveillance. It was there, visible, but it did not shine unless necessary. Just as the Council of Ten held power in reserve, ready to act but often invisible, the lantern symbolized potential. When lit, it meant something serious was occurring, an intrusion into the calm. When unlit, it meant order was maintained without spectacle. Venice valued this approach. Quiet governance was often more effective than open displays of power. Yet the watchmen were not immune to criticism. Records suggest that some citizens accused them of idleness or corruption. A few were caught accepting bribes to ignore small infractions. Others were accused of spending too much time in taverns instead of patrolling. The Republic responded with strict penalties, but the reality was that the job's monotony made lapses almost inevitable. Walking the same routes each night, hearing the same sounds, could dull vigilance. The unlit lantern, symbolic though it was, could also be an easy excuse to do less. Without a light to betray their movements, a lazy watchman might linger unseen in a doorway. Despite this, the system endured. Venice valued stability, and the watch system provided it for centuries. Even as the city declined in power after the 17th century, when trade shifted toward the Atlantic and new empires rose, the night patrols continued. They were part of Venice's identity, one of the countless small practices that distinguished it from other European states. The Republic eventually fell to Napoleon in 1797, and with its collapse, many of its institutions, including the unique night watch, faded. But the memory of the unlit lanterns remained, preserved in accounts from travelers and local chronicles. Consider how this practice might feel to someone living in Venice at the time. Imagine lying in bed in a small room above a canal, shutters closed, but hearing the faint call of the hour from the street below. You know the watchmen are there, carrying their lanterns even if you cannot see them. You drift to sleep trusting that someone else is awake. This sense of collective assurance was one of the hidden strengths of the Republic. Even the poorest citizen could feel protected by the nightly rhythm of patrols. The symbolic weight of the lantern also resonates in the broader history of light and darkness. In many societies, light was associated with safety and darkness with danger. Venice inverted this expectation. Here, darkness was embraced as part of the city's identity. The unlit lantern showed that order did not always require illumination. Control could be silent, almost invisible, and yet no less powerful. It was a reminder that light was not always necessary to create security. Sometimes, the mere suggestion of readiness was enough. There is also a curious connection between the unlit lanterns and the Venetian tradition of masks. During festivals and carnivals, citizens wore masks to obscure their identities, creating a culture where appearances concealed truths. The lanterns echoed this habit. They were objects of concealment rather than revelation, carried but hidden, symbols of authority that spoke through absence rather than presence. Both practices reflected a society deeply invested in ambiguity, discretion, and the management of appearances. In the end, the Watchmen's story is not about dramatic events, but about persistence. They rarely performed acts of heroism. Their reports, preserved in archives, are filled with ordinary details, notes on drunken brawls, records of curfew violations, small thefts stopped in progress. Yet this ordinariness is what gave Venice its longevity. Empires rise and fall through wars and conquests, but cities endure through habits, rules, and the steady work of people like the Night Watch. Today, visitors to Venice may walk the same alleys at night, guided by electric lamps and crowded with tourists. The idea of a man carrying an unlit lantern seems archaic, almost absurd. Yet if you pause in a quiet street, far from the crowds, you can almost imagine it. The faint sound of water, the hush of distant footsteps, and the knowledge that someone, centuries ago, stood in that very place, holding a lantern that never burned unless needed. The unlit lantern raises a final question. Was it ultimately more useful as a tool or as a symbol? Did it matter more in practical emergencies, or in the quiet reassurance it offered citizens who knew their watchmen carried them? The sources do not provide a simple answer, leaving us with a small mystery. Perhaps that is what makes the story worth remembering. A detail so small, so ordinary, becomes a window into an entire society's values, its caution, its discipline, and its quiet way of maintaining order. The uneventful reign of a forgotten Hittite prince. The Hittite Empire, centered in Anatolia during the 2nd millennium BCE, is often remembered for its kings, its wars with Egypt, and its role as one of the great Bronze Age powers. Yet in the shadows of those rulers, there were princes, sons of kings whose lives rarely became the stuff of epic inscriptions. One such figure, preserved faintly in the records, lived not in glory but in the slow, steady rhythm of uneventful duty. To explore his story is to step into the quiet world of a man whose reign never brought great battles or sweeping changes, yet whose existence reflects how empires survived through ordinary governance as much as through heroics. You must picture the Hittite world first. Its capital, Hattusa, was built high on the Anatolian plateau, surrounded by walls that stretched for miles, studded with massive gates decorated with lions and sphinxes. The city's winters were harsh, its summers dry. To live here was to endure extremes, with cold winds sweeping over stone streets and a sense of isolation on the edge of mountains and steppe. Within this fortified space lived the royal family, nobles, scribes, priests, and a population of craftsmen and farmers. The city was the heart of an empire that stretched into Syria and rivaled Egypt itself. Our forgotten prince, whose name appears only in fragments of tablets, was not destined for kingship. His father ruled, his elder brothers were groomed for succession, and he was given a smaller role, perhaps overseeing a provincial city or commanding a small garrison. His reign, if it can be called that, was uneventful. There are no records of his military campaigns, no treaties bearing his seal, no great monuments dedicated in his honor. What survives instead are glimpses, lists of rations provided to him and his household, notes of his attendance at religious festivals, and the occasional mention in correspondence. From these fragments, a picture emerges. His life was one of rituals and responsibilities, none dramatic but all essential. Each day began with offerings to the gods. The Hittites were deeply religious, their pantheon crowded with deities of weather, earth, and sky. As a prince, he was expected to perform prayers and sacrifices, not out of personal devotion alone but as part of maintaining cosmic balance. A missed ritual could invite misfortune, so even the smallest duties carried weight. Yet they were repetitive, performed day after day with little variation. You can imagine him standing before an altar, reciting hymns that had been spoken for centuries, his words blending into the long continuity of tradition. When not engaged in religious obligations, he dealt with administration. Provinces needed supervision, taxes needed collection, and disputes among local lords required mediation. Unlike the drama of kings negotiating with foreign powers, the prince's tasks involved grain shipments, maintenance of irrigation canals, and ensuring that soldiers received their rations. The tablets record quantities, so many measures of barley, so many jars of oil, each number representing the slow machinery of empire. To the modern reader, these details seem tedious, but they were the foundation of stability. Without them, the Hittite state would have crumbled. The prince's household also required attention. As a member of the royal family, he was entitled to a retinue of servants, guards, and scribes. Their presence reinforced his status, yet they also created constant responsibilities. Who received what pay? Which servants performed their duties properly? Were the guards disciplined? These were the kinds of questions he confronted daily, none dramatic, but each contributing to the slow pulse of his life. Occasionally, he traveled. The Hittite Empire relied on regional governors to oversee distant territories, but members of the royal family often inspected them. For the prince, such journeys would have been among the few interruptions in an otherwise steady routine. He might have ridden for days across dusty roads, stopping at way stations where scribes kept records of travelers. The landscape of Anatolia was rugged, with mountains, valleys, and scattered villages. Each stop meant hearing petitions, resolving minor disputes, and reminding local leaders of their loyalty to Hattusa. The lanterns of Venetian watchmen had their silent symbolism centuries later, but here the prince's very presence was the symbol, an embodiment of imperial authority simply by being seen. What makes his reign so uneventful is precisely the lack of crises. Many rulers of the ancient world are remembered because disaster or conflict thrust them into action. This prince faced no great invasion, no rebellion, no famine severe enough to demand extraordinary measures. Instead, he presided over continuity. His scribes wrote the same reports year after year. Harvests sufficient, temples supplied, soldiers provisioned. To us, these records might seem dull, but they suggest a kind of quiet success. Stability, after all, is often more valuable than glory. Still, the silence of the records leaves questions. What did he think of his role? Did he long for recognition, frustrated that his life produced no grand inscriptions? Or did he find comfort in predictability, preferring the steady rhythm of duty to the uncertainty of war? The tablets do not say. They leave us only with the image of a man who lived and governed in the shadows of greater names, yet whose uneventful reign helped maintain the empire's strength. To grasp his importance, you must imagine the alternative. If he had failed in his duties, if taxes had gone uncollected, if soldiers had gone hungry, if rituals had been neglected, the cracks in the empire might have widened. The Hittites, like all empires, depended not only on kings and generals but on countless administrators whose names are barely remembered. The Forgotten Prince was one such figure, a reminder that history is built not only by those who conquer but also by those who maintain. What remains unresolved is why his memory faded so completely. Was it because his life lacked drama, and scribes preferred to record victories? Or was it because, when the empire itself collapsed at the end of the Bronze Age, his name simply vanished in the wider destruction of archives and temples? The loss of memory is itself part of history, a silence that speaks as loudly as inscriptions. The more closely you look at the fragmentary records of this prince's life, the more you begin to see the outlines of a world where monotony was not failure but survival. For the Hittite Empire, which often found itself surrounded by enemies, the Egyptians to the south, the Mitanni and later the Assyrians to the east, and restless peoples in Anatolia itself, peace was fragile. That one provincial ruler could live out his years without facing dramatic upheaval was unusual. His very uneventfulness is a clue to how carefully managed the empire had to be. Daily administration was the lifeblood of Hittite power. Clay tablets found in archives show endless lists. Rations of grain for garrisons, distributions of wool for temple workers, tallies of livestock sent as offerings. These documents are boring in the strictest sense. They lack narrative and emotion, but they reveal what the prince spent much of his time overseeing. A shipment delayed by poor roads, a dispute between two villages over water rights, or the slow collection of surplus barley. Such matters never made epic inscriptions, but they determined whether soldiers marched fed or hungry, whether temples were stocked or empty. The prince's scribes handled the writing, but he was the figure of authority who approved or enforced these decisions. When villagers came with petitions, they addressed him, not the scribe. To them, he represented the empire, its weight, and its stability. His decisions were expected to reflect fairness, but fairness in this context did not mean equality as we understand it. It meant consistency, ensuring that obligations were met, that taxes flowed, that religious duties were performed in proper order. Continuity was valued above innovation. Religion itself formed much of his routine. The Hittite world was densely populated with gods. Every mountain, spring, or storm seemed to have its own deity, and the pantheon absorbed gods from conquered peoples. The prince, like all members of the royal family, had to serve as a caretaker of this divine network. Festivals marked the calendar, and in them he participated with precise, ritualized gestures, pouring libations, presenting loaves of bread, bowing before idols. The tablets described these actions in exact detail, down to how many sheep or how many jars of beer were to be offered. His role was to enact these instructions faithfully, not to question them. To miss a ritual was considered dangerous, not just for himself but for the community, since the god's anger could manifest as drought, plague, or defeat in war. Yet his world was not entirely static. Diplomatic correspondence from this period shows that even minor princes sometimes acted as intermediaries. A message might be sent through him to a neighboring state, or he might host envoys who passed through his province. These encounters gave him small windows into the larger world of international politics, the great power struggles between Hutti and Egypt, the shifting alliances with smaller states like Ugarit or Amuru. He himself left no treaties, but his presence as a local authority helped facilitate the flow of messages and goods. Archaeology also suggests what his surroundings looked like. Provincial centers often had modest palaces, built of stone foundations with mud brick walls. These were not as grand as Hattusa but were large enough to contain storerooms, reception halls, and living quarters. In such a residence, the prince sat in audience, received reports, and distributed orders. The walls might have been decorated with simple frescoes or reliefs, but more often they were plain. His furniture would have been wooden, his clothing of wool or linen, his meals simple but steady. Bread, meat when available, beer or wine. Nothing in this lifestyle suggested luxury beyond what was necessary to mark him as royal. What is striking is how little of his life was aimed at being remembered. Kings built monuments with their names carved in stone. They commissioned temples, celebrated victories, and left behind grand inscriptions. The forgotten prince did none of this. His legacy was tied to function, not to memory. His records survived not because he sought immortality, but because scribes needed to tally grain and livestock. He was documented in the machinery of bureaucracy rather than in the rhetoric of greatness. Still, one can imagine that he may have had ambitions. Perhaps he watched his elder brothers prepare for succession and wondered if fate might shift in his favor. Illness, assassination, or political intrigue sometimes altered the line of kingship unexpectedly. But if he ever hoped for such a change, it never came. Instead, his life followed the same pattern for years. He presided over ceremonies, maintained stability in his territory, and aged without achieving the kind of recognition that filled inscriptions. What makes his story compelling in its dullness is the realization that most of history is made by such figures. For every king remembered in textbooks, dozens of lesser rulers ensured that society functioned day by day. Without them, there would have been no empire for the kings to claim. The uneventful reign of this prince, marked by records of barley and sheep, was as essential to the survival of Hutti as the dramatic victories carved into stone by his father. This perspective shifts how we understand power. It was not only about triumphs in battle or alliances sealed by marriage. It was also about managing the steady grind of administration. For the Hittites, this grind was sacred. The act of maintaining order, ensuring the gods received their due, ensuring the people obeyed, ensuring the empire's resources flowed, was itself a victory, even if it was never celebrated as such. As we try to piece together his life, one unresolved question emerges. Did he see himself as forgotten even while alive? Did he recognize that his brothers' names would endure while his would fade? Or was he content to serve, knowing that the stability he maintained was its own reward? The silence of the tablets leaves this unanswered. All we can do is imagine him standing in a dim hall, a tablet in front of him listing grain shipments, aware that his duty was important but also aware that no bard would ever sing of it. When the story of this forgotten prince reaches its close, it is not marked by battle, conquest, or scandal. Instead, it fades much as it began, into the quiet records of daily administration. The last mentions of him in surviving tablets are simple: allocations of rations to his household, references to his participation in a festival, notes of his attendance at a council session. After that, silence. His name, already faint in the archives, disappears completely. Unlike kings, who sought to immortalize themselves with monuments, this prince left no deliberate trace. His legacy was folded into the broader fabric of an empire that itself would eventually fall. To understand what his uneventful reign meant, you must see it in the larger picture of the Hittite world. The empire endured through both dramatic episodes and quiet stability. While kings fought wars, princes like him maintained the provincial structures that kept food moving, soldiers fed, and rituals performed. Without this slow and steady governance, the empire would have collapsed under its own weight. His life, though forgotten, was part of the hidden architecture of survival. Imagine the final years of his role. He would have grown older, perhaps with sons of his own, perhaps not. His responsibilities would not have changed much. He still oversaw taxes, managed disputes, and performed rituals. His body aged, but the duties remained the same. The monotony of daily life might have grown heavier, yet the very act of repeating those routines tied him into a long chain of continuity. Every offering he made, every dispute he judged, connected him to generations of officials before and after. His individual name may have been lost, but his actions blended into the rhythm of empire. The collapse of the Hittite Empire in the 12th century BCE erased much of this world. The causes remain debated: invasions by the so-called Sea Peoples, internal strife, famine, climate shifts. Whatever the reasons, the great capital of Hattusa was abandoned, its archives buried under centuries of earth. The forgotten prince did not live to see this, but his memory was buried along with his city. His uneventful reign vanished not because it was unimportant, but because history tends to preserve the dramatic while discarding the steady. And yet, when archaeologists uncovered the ruins of Hattusa in the early 20th century, they found the clay tablets that once recorded his duties. In those marks, pressed into wet clay by scribes 3,000 years earlier, his presence flickers back into view. Not in glory, but in lists. So many sheep provided. So many jars of beer for the festival. So many measures of barley for the prince's household. Each number is a ghost of his life, a reminder that even the uneventful left its trace. His story teaches a different lesson about power. We often think of history as shaped by those who sought greatness. But this prince reveals another truth. Empires survive as much by the ordinary as by the extraordinary. His lack of drama was not failure. It was stability. It was the assurance that in one corner of the empire, life carried on without disruption. For his people, that was perhaps more valuable than any conquest. It also forces you to reflect on memory itself. Why do some figures endure while others vanish? Is greatness only measured in victories, or can it also be found in the maintenance of peace? The Forgotten Prince challenges the way we think about legacy. His uneventful reign may not inspire epics, but it represents the countless lives whose steady efforts held civilizations together. Without them, the great kings remembered in stone would have had nothing to stand upon. Now, when you think of him, picture a quiet evening in a provincial palace. The air is cool, the lamps flicker softly, and a scribe sits at a low table, pressing marks into clay. The prince listens to a report about grain storage, nods, and gives his approval. Nothing extraordinary happens. Yet, in that moment, the empire continues. That is his story. Not a tale of triumph or defeat, but of persistence. And perhaps the final unresolved question is this: in our own time, do we remember too little of those who built stability? Should the uneventful reigns of forgotten figures weigh more heavily in our understanding of the past? Their silence challenges us to look beyond monuments and victories, to see history not only in the exceptional but in the steady hands that carried it forward. How Inca messengers ate on long mountain roads. The Inca Empire, which stretched across much of the Andes in the 15th and 16th centuries, was held together not only by its armies and rulers but also by its messengers. Known as chasquis, these men carried information along the empire's vast network of roads, running across mountains, valleys, and deserts. Their work was essential for communication, yet what makes their story fascinating is not only their speed or endurance, but the simple question of how they sustained themselves on those long journeys. In the silence of high mountains and the thin air of the Altiplano, what did an Inca messenger eat? And how did those meals shape their ability to keep the empire connected? To begin, you must picture the geography. The Andes are some of the most formidable mountains in the world, stretching thousands of miles. The Inca built over 25,000 miles of roads across this terrain, with suspension bridges of woven grass, stone stairways carved into cliffs, and paths that climbed high into the cold air where little grows. The chasquis were stationed at wayhouses called tambos, spaced roughly every 10 to 15 kilometers. They worked in relay, one runner passing a message or object to the next. This system allowed the Inca to move information from Cuzco to distant provinces with astonishing speed, sometimes covering hundreds of miles in just a few days. But running such distances required fuel, and here the Inca revealed their ingenuity. The staple of their diet was charqui, strips of dried meat, usually from llama or alpaca. This is the origin of the word jerky that we still use today. Charqui was lightweight, easy to carry, and long-lasting, making it perfect for men constantly in motion. A chasca could chew a piece as he ran, swallowing slowly while continuing his stride. Combined with charqui were small pouches of roasted maize kernels. These could be eaten like nuts, providing energy and a satisfying crunch. Together, they formed the basic portable meal of the messengers. Another important food was chuno, a freeze-dried potato created by leaving potatoes out in the cold of Andean nights and then pressing out the water. Chuno could last for years without spoiling and was incredibly light. A handful carried in a pouch could be rehydrated in a pot of water at a tambo, providing a filling stew. For a messenger, chuno meant security. Even if supplies were low, he could survive on this preserved potato, which carried both cultural and practical significance. At tambos, the diet expanded. These wayhouses were stocked with food and supplies by the state. Here, chasquis might receive bowls of quinoa porridge, maize beer called chicha, or stews made with beans and peppers. These meals gave them rest between runs, though the time spent at tambos was often short, since the relay system required constant movement. Still, the knowledge that food awaited them at regular intervals must have provided comfort as they ran through the thin air of the Andes. The chasca diet was shaped not only by practicality but by the empire's organization. The Inca state controlled food production through its system of storehouses, which kept surpluses collected as tax from farmers. These surpluses ensured that the runners never lacked supplies. They could depend on finding charqui, chuno, and maize at tambos, which reduced the need to carry heavy loads themselves. Unlike other messengers in the ancient world who relied on hunting or begging for food, the Inca runners were supported by an entire logistical network. It is worth pausing to imagine the sensory details of their meals. A strip of charqui, tough and salty, chewed slowly as the runner climbed a mountain trail. A handful of toasted maize, crunchy and filling, eaten while resting on a rock before passing a message to the next runner. A bowl of steaming quinoa porridge at a tambo, warming the body before another long stretch. These were not luxurious foods, but they were efficient and sustaining. For men whose bodies were constantly pushed to the limit, they were as vital as the messages they carried. We also find that coca leaves played a significant role. The chewing of coca, mixed with a small amount of lime to release its alkaloids, helped runners endure altitude, suppress hunger, and maintain stamina. This was not a meal in the traditional sense, but it was part of their fuel. With a wad of coca leaves in their mouths, the Chasquis could run longer without stopping, their fatigue dulled by the mild stimulant. Spanish chroniclers often noted this practice, sometimes with suspicion, but for the runners it was an essential survival tool. Their diet reveals something important about how the Inca understood endurance. It was not only about training bodies to run, but about designing foods that could sustain effort in extreme conditions. Preserved meat, dried potatoes, roasted maize, and coca leaves formed a system of nutrition perfectly adapted to the Andes. Each item was lightweight, durable, and easy to consume while moving. Each represented centuries of Andean knowledge about how to survive in a land of high mountains and thin air. The question remains, though, what happened when a runner was caught far from a tambo, or when supplies failed? The Andes were not forgiving, and accidents happened. In such cases, the runner might rely on wild plants, edible roots, berries, or herbs known to local communities. Oral traditions suggest that runners were trained to recognize these resources, though documentation is sparse. More often, however, the empire's careful planning prevented such emergencies. The Chasca system functioned because the Inca invested in maintaining tambos and storehouses, ensuring that their messengers did not face hunger on the roads. And yet, in reflecting on their lives, you must wonder, did the food ever feel monotonous? Day after day, the same strips of meat, the same dried potatoes, the same toasted maize. Did the Chasquis dream of variety, of flavors richer than their utilitarian diet offered? Or did the pride of serving the empire, the knowledge that their speed bound the vast territories together, make such concerns irrelevant? Their silence in the records leaves this question unanswered. What remains is the certainty that their meals, however simple, were as essential to the empire as their feet. Without steady fuel, no runner could carry a message from the coast to Cuzco in days. Without preserved foods, no tambo could sustain a constant flow of messengers. Without coca leaves, no body could endure the thin air of the Andes hour after hour. The empire depended on this balance between body and food, endurance and sustenance. But there is still an unresolved thought. How much of the Inca Empire's strength rested not on its armies or rulers but on the quiet meals of its runners, eaten in haste on lonely mountain roads? If you follow the life of an Inca messenger more closely, you begin to see that his meals were not only about keeping his body moving but also about maintaining the rhythm of the empire itself. Every bite of charqui, every mouthful of chuno, every handful of roasted maize connected him to a vast system of organization and control that stretched from Cuzco to the farthest frontiers. The food he ate was more than sustenance. It was evidence of a civilization that planned every detail of survival in one of the world's most difficult landscapes. The Inca state managed food through its famous storehouses, or calcas, which dotted the empire's roads and valleys. These structures, often built on hillsides to take advantage of wind and dryness, preserved enormous stocks of dried potatoes, maize, quinoa, beans, and preserved meats. For the messengers, these calcas were lifelines. They ensured that each tambo was stocked, that each runner could expect reliable supplies. Archaeological remains show that some of these storehouses were massive, capable of feeding thousands of people for months. The Chasquis, who carried messages vital to administration, were among the first to benefit from this system. It is worth imagining the scene inside a tambo. A weary runner arrives, his chest heaving, sweat glistening on his skin despite the cold mountain air. He passes the message to the next runner, who darts off almost immediately. The one who has finished collapses onto a bench, is handed a bowl of stew thick with chuno and beans, perhaps flavored with herbs, perhaps only plain. He eats quickly, knowing his rest will not last long. Beside him sits a scribe, recording the arrival, while a storehouse keeper tallies supplies. This cycle repeats at each tambo night and day without pause. Food is the constant thread binding it all together. The meals also reflected social order. The Inca Empire was not built on private markets but on redistribution. Farmers paid their taxes not with coins but with crops and labor. Those crops flowed into the storehouses, from which the state redistributed them to soldiers, priests, builders, and chasquis. When a messenger ate a bowl of quinoa or tore a piece of siacharqui, he was consuming the labor of distant farmers whose work had been collected and organized by the empire. His meal was both personal fuel and a reflection of imperial power. Spanish chroniclers, who first encountered the Inca system in the 16th century, were astonished by its efficiency. They noted how messages moved with extraordinary speed, how supplies were always available, how runners seemed tireless. But they rarely paid attention to the food. To them, the meals were too plain, too ordinary to merit description. Yet it was these very foods, potatoes dried on frosty nights, maize roasted until hard, llama meat sliced thin and cured in the sun, that gave the messengers their endurance. The Spaniards missed what was most important: that the Inca had built a civilization where survival foods were transformed into a logistical miracle. Consider the cultural weight of these foods. Chuno, for example, was not merely a potato but a product of intimate knowledge of Andean climate. By leaving potatoes on the ground at night to freeze, then stepping on them to press out the water, Andean farmers had invented freeze-drying centuries before modern technology. This preserved food could be stored for years. For the chasquis, chuno meant reliability. No matter the season, no matter the altitude, a small bag of chuno guaranteed nourishment. In times of famine, chuno kept entire communities alive. For runners, it was as close to immortality as food could provide. Coca leaves, too, carried deep meaning. While Europeans often dismissed them as dangerous or exotic, in Andean culture they were sacred. They were offered to gods, used in rituals, and shared as gifts. For the chasquis, coca was both medicine and companion. A wad of leaves, chewed slowly, dulled hunger and eased fatigue. At altitudes above 12,000 feet, where oxygen is thin and every breath feels incomplete, coca gave the body an edge. Combined with small meals of maize or chuno, it allowed the messengers to maintain their relentless pace. There is also the question of water. Runners carried small gourds or stopped at streams along the roads. The Andes, despite their harshness, are filled with rivers and springs, though some routes passed through deserts where water was scarcer. At tambos, clay jars of chicha, a lightly fermented maize drink, were often provided. Chicha was more than refreshment. It was a symbol of hospitality and community. To drink it was to be welcomed by the empire itself, a reassurance that even in the most remote outposts, the state remembered you. The monotony of diet must have weighed on the messengers at times. Siacharqui was tough, chuno bland, maize repetitive. Yet variety was not the point. Predictability was. When a runner set out, he knew exactly what awaited him. Fuel that would not spoil, meals that would sustain, no matter how dull. In this way, food became part of the psychological strength of the chasquis. They could focus on running, not on wondering where the next meal would come from. The symbolism of these foods extended even into the Spanish conquest. Chroniclers noted that after the fall of the empire, the road system quickly declined. Without the state maintaining tambos and storehouses, messengers could no longer rely on food supplies. The network fell silent. It was not only war that ended the Inca system, it was the collapse of food logistics. The same chuno and siacharqui that had fueled the runners became reminders of a lost order, still eaten by Andean communities but stripped of their imperial context. And so, when you imagine an Inca messenger on the road, do not think only of his speed or stamina. Think also of the quiet moments when he reached into his pouch for a handful of toasted maize. Think of the small bowl of chuno stew at a tambo, steaming in the cold night. Think of the coca leaves in his cheek, numbing his hunger as he climbed yet another mountain trail. These were the details that made his extraordinary service possible. But an unresolved thought lingers. Did the runners themselves ever reflect on the weight of what they carried? Not only messages, but the empire's dependence on their small meals? Or did they see themselves only as ordinary men, running, eating, resting, and running again, unaware that they were the lifeblood of one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world? As the story of the Inca messengers draws to its conclusion, it becomes clear that their meals were not simply about feeding individual runners, but about sustaining an empire. The Chasca diet represents a meeting point of endurance, culture, and logistics. In the silence of mountain passes and the vast stretches of Andean plains, Those small bites of ciacharchi, chuno, and maize carried more weight than they appeared to. They were the hidden foundation of a communication system that bound together millions of people. Picture one of the last runs of a seasoned chaska. His legs are strong, his lungs hardened by years of running through thin air. He begins at dawn, chewing coca leaves, the taste bitter yet comforting. As he runs, he feels the sun rise over snow-capped peaks, the wind cutting down from glaciers. His pouch rattles with kernels of toasted maize. He takes a few into his mouth, chewing slowly, each bite transforming into energy. By midday, he reaches a tambo, hands off the message, and pauses just long enough for a bowl of warm chuno stew. Then he continues another stretch, another road, the same food sustaining him again and again. His life is a pattern of running and eating, a rhythm as old as the empire itself. The genius of this system was its reliability. By relying on preserved foods, the Inca minimized risk. There was no dependence on hunting, no gambling on chance meals. Instead, they drew on an entire agricultural machine that gathered, dried, stored, and redistributed food. Every runner, every soldier, every official depended on it. And because food was so central, the empire invested heavily in its management. The food eaten by a single chaska, seemingly trivial, was in fact evidence of the empire's capacity to turn labor and land into endurance and speed. The symbolism of food also carried into the rituals surrounding the runners. Before beginning a particularly long journey, a chaska might offer a pinch of coca leaves to the gods of the mountains, asking for protection. He might spill a few drops of chicha on the ground before drinking, honoring the earth that sustained him. Even eating was embedded in spirituality, a reminder that survival in the Andes was never taken for granted. Every mouthful of chuno was more than fuel. It was also a gesture of connection to ancestors, to gods, and to the land itself. It is striking that the Spanish conquest disrupted this balance so quickly. When the empire fell, the tambos were abandoned or repurposed. The storehouses emptied, their system of redistribution dismantled. The chaskis lost their network, and with it their ability to function at the same level. European horses replaced runners for communication, but the efficiency was never the same. The quiet meals of the messengers, once a guarantee of stability, became memories. The foods themselves, jerky, chuno, toasted maize, survived in Andean communities, but stripped of their imperial context, they no longer carried the same symbolic weight. And yet, when you look closely, their legacy remains. Modern Andean peoples still prepare chuno, still chew coca leaves, still eat ciacharqui and roasted maize. These foods continue to fuel people who live and work at high altitudes, just as they did centuries ago. In this way, the diet of the Inca messengers endures, not only in history but in everyday life. The runners may be gone, but the knowledge of how to survive in the Andes through food has not disappeared. The story of their meals also offers a broader reflection on how empires function. We often think of power in terms of kings, armies, and monuments, but here we see that power also rested on bowls of porridge and strips of dried meat. The empire's strength lay not only in its ability to conquer, but in its ability to feed men who could carry words across mountains. Without those meals, the network collapsed. Without the network, the empire itself could not hold together. So, what remains unresolved is this: when we remember the Inca, do we think enough about the role of ordinary sustenance? Do we give weight to the chuno and coca leaves, to the roasted maize chewed on lonely trails? Or do we still, like the Spanish chroniclers, overlook the simple meals that sustained the extraordinary? The silence of the messengers leaves us with questions, but their food leaves us with answers too. Answers about resilience, about planning, and about the quiet strength of ordinary things. The endless notes of Ottoman palace accountants. The grandeur of the Ottoman Empire is often remembered through its sultans, its armies, and its magnificent architecture. The domes of mosques, the sweep of armies across Europe and Asia, the glitter of treasures displayed in the Topkapi Palace. These are the images that dominate memory. Yet beneath this splendor lay another world, less visible but just as essential. The world of the accountants who filled endless ledgers with numbers. In the silence of palace chambers, these men wrote figures that determined whether the empire could feed its armies, pay its officials, and maintain its power. Their lives were not filled with battles or pageantry, but with ink, parchment, and calculation. Imagine a palace office in the 16th century. The Topkapi complex sprawled above the Bosphorus, a city within a city. Courtyards opened into gardens, halls led into chambers, and in one corner sat the Defterhane, the Bureau of Ledgers. Here, accountants labored over volumes known as defters, thick books filled with records of taxes, expenditures, and inventories. The smell of ink and parchment lingered in the air, mixed with the faint scent of wax candles. Rows of desks held scribes, each bent over his work, reed pens scratching steadily. The accountant's day began not with speeches or ceremonies, but with lists. Shipments of grain arriving from Egypt, revenues from Balkan villages, stipends owed to janissaries, costs of repairing fortresses. Each item had to be recorded in precise order. The Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents, and its wealth was vast, but without accounting, wealth could vanish. The scribe's task was to ensure that every coin and every bushel of wheat was noted. This was not glamorous, but it was power in its own quiet way. Consider how much detail was required. A single page might list dozens of villages, each with their tax obligations measured in kind. So many sheep, so many bushels of barley, so many jars of honey. The accountant recorded them all, column after column, number after number. Mistakes were not tolerated. To misrecord a tax could bring punishment, for the empire depended on accuracy. The figures written in ink shaped decisions made by viziers and sultans. Behind every campaign lay the calculations of accountants, determining whether the treasury could sustain another war. The accountants themselves lived modestly. They were not janissaries, celebrated in parades, nor viziers, weighed down with jewels. Their prestige came from their knowledge. Training was long, requiring not only literacy but a mastery of Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. Since documents flowed in all 3, they studied mathematics, learned to use abacuses, and memorized formats for ledgers. Only the most disciplined could succeed. To be admitted into the Defterhane was to join a brotherhood of men who lived by precision. Yet their work was monotonous. Day after day, they copied numbers into ledgers. They balanced columns, checked tallies, and compared notes with colleagues. Their eyes strained in candlelight, their fingers stained with ink. Breaks were brief. A sip of coffee, a short prayer, then back to the endless rows of figures. Some scribes worked for decades, their entire lives consumed by numbers that blurred together. Few of their names survived, for what mattered was the record, not the man. Still, their influence reached far. When a sultan planned a campaign, he consulted the ledgers. Could the treasury afford to pay the janissaries for 6 months? Could ships be stocked with enough grain for a long siege? If the numbers did not add up, even the most ambitious plan could be delayed. In this way, the accountants were hidden gatekeepers of empire. They did not command armies, but they determined whether armies marched at all. The ledgers also reveal the empire's complexity. One book might track the revenues of a province, listing not only taxes but also fines, fees, and tithes. Another might record expenditures on palace kitchens, noting how much rice, lamb, and spices were purchased for feasts. Still another might detail stipends for scholars, imams, or artisans employed by the court. Together, they created a web of information that bound the empire's finances. The scribe's steady writing gave structure to a world that might otherwise dissolve into chaos. Imagine, too, the psychological effect of such work. To spend hours copying figures requires patience. The accountant had to trust in the importance of detail, even when the work felt invisible. He knew that no one would praise him for recording 25 sacks of lentils delivered to the palace kitchens. Yet without his note, the kitchens might run short, and a banquet might fail, angering the sultan. In this way, the accountant's anonymous labor supported the pageantry of empire. The story of these accountants is boring in the purest sense. It is filled with numbers, routines, and repetition. Yet this boredom was essential. The empire survived because men were willing to fill endless pages with ink, to record every sheep and every coin, to sit in quiet rooms while the world outside celebrated victories. Their silence was the background against which the Ottoman Empire flourished. But one unresolved question remains. Did the accountants themselves ever reflect on the weight of their work, or did they see it only as routine? When they bent over their ledgers late at night, did they realize they were holding the empire together, or did they believe themselves lost in monotony, their names destined to vanish even as their numbers endured? The world of the Ottoman accountant was not one of sudden drama but of enduring routine. Day after day, year after year, he recorded figures in ledgers that grew as heavy as the empire itself. His office in the Defterhane was orderly, the desks aligned, the shelves stacked with books bound in leather, their pages filled with columns of ink. The air was dry, kept so deliberately to preserve the parchment, and windows were often shuttered to protect the fragile documents from sunlight. In this atmosphere of silence, the accountants lived their professional lives. Training for this role shaped both mind and body. A boy destined for the scribal service was often identified early, his aptitude for numbers noted by a local teacher. From there, he might be sent to a madriz, where he would study language, arithmetic, and calligraphy. He learned how to prepare ink from soot, how to cut and trim reed pens, and how to write in a hand that was both elegant and exact. Accuracy mattered, but so did beauty. A ledger was not simply a list of figures, it was a state document, and its script reflected the dignity of the empire. The accountant's work was structured by the fiscal calendar. Certain months demanded more activity, when taxes were due or stipends distributed. During these times, the Defterhane was filled with urgency. Messengers arrived with satchels of documents from distant provinces. Officials pressed for reports, and ledgers were updated constantly. At quieter times, the accountants checked and rechecked earlier entries, ensuring that no errors had crept in. A single mistake could ripple outward, creating confusion in distant provinces. To prevent this, multiple clerks cross-checked each other's work, a system that kept the empire's finances steady. It is important to remember that the Ottoman state was vast and diverse. Revenues came in many forms: silver coins from mines in the Balkans, silk from Anatolia, wheat from Egypt, tribute from vassal states, and taxes from peasants across the empire. Each of these had to be recorded, translated into numbers that could be balanced against expenditures. The accountants dealt with sheep, honey, timber, and spices just as carefully as they dealt with coins. Nothing was too small to record. If a province sent 12 falcons as part of its tax obligation, those falcons appeared in the defter, noted in the same precise columns as barley or gold. The monotony of this work was broken only by the occasional inspection. High-ranking officials, sometimes even the Grand Vizier, would examine the ledgers, checking for irregularities. These inspections created anxiety. An accountant whose numbers did not add up could face severe punishment. Some were fined, others dismissed, and in cases of fraud, execution was not unheard of. The fear of error kept the accountants disciplined. Their ledgers were their protection. If their numbers were correct, their position was safe. Yet for all its dullness, the work gave accountants an unusual perspective. They saw the empire not in stories of war or ceremony, but in the flow of resources. Where others saw armies, they saw the rations needed to feed them. Where others saw a new mosque, they saw the costs of its stone and labor. To them, the empire was not glory but arithmetic, not conquest but columns. This perspective gave them a kind of hidden power. They knew which provinces were wealthy, which struggled, which years brought good harvests, and which saw famine. Few others had such a broad view of the empire's health. Consider also the accountant's daily rhythm. He rose before dawn, prayed, and ate a simple breakfast, often bread, olives, and cheese. He entered the Defterhane as the sun rose, taking his place among rows of scribes. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the scratching of pens. Midday, the call to prayer echoed through the palace, and the scribes paused to pray and eat. Lunch might be a bowl of lentil soup, bread, and fruit, eaten quickly before returning to their ledgers. The afternoon was spent in the same labor, the repetition of numbers stretching into evening. When the candles were lit, their wax dripping onto wooden desks, the accountants pressed on until the day's work was done. Then they closed the heavy books, locked them in storerooms, and left, their eyes tired, their backs stiff, their hands stained with ink. Some scribes spent their entire lives in this cycle. A young apprentice might enter the office at 15 and remain until he was too old to write steadily. His career produced no fame, but it produced thousands of pages of records that endured beyond his lifetime. The empire depended on such men. Their anonymity was their strength. Unlike soldiers who risked death in battle or viziers who risked disgrace in court politics, the accountants survived by being invisible. Their duty was to record, not to be remembered. But invisibility can also lead to questions. Did they ever feel the weight of being forgotten? Did they envy the janissaries who paraded through the streets or the poets whose verses were recited in salons? Or did they take pride in their quiet role, knowing that the empire could not exist without their ledgers? The silence of history leaves this unresolved. The accountants themselves wrote only numbers, not reflections. Their voices are absent, replaced by figures that speak without words. And yet, if you look at the defters that survive today in archives, you see their lives inscribed in ink. Each number, each careful column, is the trace of a hand that worked patiently centuries ago. The accountant may have been forgotten, but his work endures. The empire itself has fallen, but the ledgers remain, testifying to the boring, relentless, essential work of men who spent their lives adding, subtracting, and balancing the resources of a vast state. Still, one unresolved thought lingers. Was the true strength of the Ottoman Empire its armies and sultans, or was it the endless notes of its accountants, whose columns of ink quietly held the empire together? When you follow the path of an Ottoman palace accountant to the end of his career, the conclusion is as quiet as the work itself. There is no grand farewell, no parade in the streets, no monument carved with his name. Instead, his final years blur into the same rhythm of ink, parchment, and numbers that filled his youth and middle age. The only sign of his passing from the empire's machinery is that another hand takes up the pen where his left off. In this way, the accountants embodied the permanence of the state. Individual lives ended, but the ledgers continued, their columns of figures stretching unbroken across generations. The empire itself depended on this continuity. Sultans came and went, viziers rose and fell, janissaries rebelled and were suppressed, but the accountants remained. The Defterhane never closed, its scribes filling book after book regardless of political turmoil. Even in moments of crisis, when armies clashed at Vienna, when rebellions broke out in Anatolia, when the treasury strained under war, the accountants still recorded taxes, still noted stipends, still tracked shipments of grain. Their world was insulated, steady, boring in a way that gave stability to the empire. What makes their story remarkable is the scale of their work. The defters that survive number in the tens of thousands, some of them weighing several kilograms, filled with meticulous handwriting. Each one represents countless hours of labor. Together, they create one of the most detailed financial records of any pre-modern empire. Historians today can reconstruct the life of an Ottoman village, the size of its population, the nature of its crops, and the amount of its taxes, all because some anonymous accountant in a palace office wrote it down. Without those numbers, much of the empire's history would be lost. The work also reveals the Ottoman obsession with order. For the accountants, recording was not just practical but ideological. To write down every village, every bushel, every coin was to demonstrate control. Even if the empire did not always exercise real power in every distant province, the very act of recording its obligations signaled that the sultan's reach was universal. The empire was written into existence through ledgers, and the accountants, by filling page after page, were the quiet authors of that authority. It is worth imagining one of their evenings after a long day. The accountant leaves the palace grounds, stepping into the bustling streets of Istanbul. Outside, the world is noisy, filled with merchants calling out prices, coffee houses humming with conversation, children running between stalls. For a moment, he is just another man, blending into the crowd. No one knows that he spent the day recording the empire's revenues, that the figures in his head represent the lifeblood of the state. He buys bread, perhaps a few olives, and walks home. His family greets him, his children tugging at his sleeves. At home, he is not an accountant of empire but a father, a husband, an ordinary man. Then, at dawn, he returns to the palace, to the ledgers, to the endless notes that define his professional life. The contrast between the grandeur of what his numbers supported and the obscurity of his own life is striking. His ink tallies paid soldiers who marched in parades, fed artisans who built mosques, supplied scholars who wrote poems remembered today. Yet his own name did not endure. History recorded the visible outcomes, the armies, the buildings, the verses, but not the ink-stained fingers that made them possible. This erasure is itself a lesson in how societies remember. And yet, invisibility does not mean insignificance. Without the accountants, the empire could not have functioned. Their steady labor turned taxes into stipends, crops into provisions, and tributes into construction. They made abstract wealth real, translating it into the means by which the empire fed itself and projected power. If sultans were the face of authority, the accountants were its spine, hidden but essential. The story of the Ottoman accountants also offers a reflection on the nature of boredom. For them, boredom was duty. To repeat the same work every day was to serve stability. Their monotony was the empire's strength. In this sense, the endless notes of accountants remind us that history is not only made in moments of drama, but in the long stretches of ordinary repetition. Empires fall when the boring routines fail, when taxes are not collected, when ledgers are not balanced, when supplies do not arrive. Drama makes headlines, but monotony sustains life. Today, When you look at a surviving defter in an archive, bound in leather, its pages filled with columns of numbers in beautiful script, you are touching the legacy of these men. Their names are gone, but their work remains as solid as stone. They lived and died in obscurity, but their endless notes carried an empire across centuries. And perhaps the unresolved question is this: when we remember the Ottoman Empire, should we think less about the battles and more about the ledgers? Should we see the empire not only as domes and armies, but as ink and numbers, as the quiet persistence of men who wrote day after day, believing that precision was its own form of power? Peculiar sleep remedies from medieval physicians. In the Middle Ages, sleep was considered both a mystery and a necessity. People understood its importance but not its causes. Physicians, trained in the traditions of ancient Greek and Arabic medicine, explained sleep through humors, vapors, and balances within the body. Their remedies for sleeplessness, preserved in manuscripts and medical treatises, reveal a world where science, superstition, and daily life merged. To read them is to enter a quiet landscape of herbs, prayers, ointments, and peculiar advice, all offered with the promise of rest. Imagine yourself in a medieval chamber. The air is heavy with the smell of smoke from the hearth, the wooden shutters closed against the night. A physician sits with a patient who has complained of sleeplessness. He does not ask about stress or noise, as a modern doctor might. Instead, he inquires about the patient's digestion, the heaviness of the stomach, the last meal eaten, and the flow of bodily humors. In his view, insomnia was not a mental disturbance but a physical imbalance. To cure it, one must restore harmony within the body. One of the most common remedies was dietary regulation. Physicians advised avoiding heavy foods at night, especially fatty meats or large quantities of wine. Instead, they recommended warm milk with honey or light broths, which were thought to soothe the stomach and calm the mind. The advice seems familiar even today, though the reasoning behind it was couched in humoral theory. A heavy meal created excess choler or black bile, disturbing the body's balance and preventing sleep. Herbal remedies were also widespread. Poppy seeds, known for their sedative qualities, appeared in many recipes. Physicians mixed them into syrups or ground them into powders. Lettuce, believed to be cooling and soporific, was boiled and eaten before bed. The writings of Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess and healer, recommended fennel, dill, and valerian root to encourage rest. These herbs were thought to temper hot humors and promote tranquility. Patients might drink them as teas, chew them raw, or apply them in poultices. Some remedies were more unusual. Medieval physicians suggested placing amulets filled with aromatic herbs beneath the pillow. These might include lavender, chamomile, or rue, wrapped in cloth and sewn shut. The scent, they believed, soothed the senses and quieted the spirit. In other cases, ointments were applied to the temples or chest. One recipe instructed mixing rose oil with vinegar and smearing it on the forehead. Another recommended rubbing the soles of the feet with warm sheep's fat, claiming it draws down the vapors from the head. Religious practice also played a role. Since sleep was seen as a vulnerable state, where the soul might wander or be visited by dreams, prayers were often prescribed alongside herbs. Patients were told to recite psalms, repeat the Lord's Prayer, or call upon specific saints before bed. Saint Dymphna, associated with mental health, and Saint Apollonia, protector against pains, were among those invoked. Physicians did not separate body from spirit. To sleep well was to be in harmony with God as well as with humors. Another recurring theme was environment. Physicians advised sleeping in quiet, dark rooms with clean bedding. They warned against sleeping in drafts, which were thought to disturb humors, and against sharing a bed with animals, which was common in rural households. Some recommended placing smooth stones warmed by the fire beneath the sheets to relax the body. Others instructed that one's head should rest slightly elevated, to prevent digestive vapors from rising to the brain. The remedies could become even stranger. One medieval text suggests that those unable to sleep should drink a mixture of wine and lettuce juice, then listen to the sound of running water. Another prescribes boiling a hedgehog's fat with herbs and rubbing it into the chest. Still others advise tying a frog's leg in cloth and wearing it around the neck, claiming the charm could ward off restlessness. To modern eyes, these suggestions seem bizarre, but they reflect a world where medicine, magic, and nature blurred into one practice. The role of physicians was not only to treat but also to reassure. In an age when death was common and illness poorly understood, sleeplessness could feel ominous. A patient who failed to rest might believe it a sign of divine punishment or impending sickness. By prescribing rituals and remedies, physicians gave structure to fear. Even if the cure did not work, the act of following instructions provided comfort. In this sense, medieval sleep medicine was as much psychological as physical, though it was not recognized as such. Yet, there is another layer to these remedies. Many of them reveal a surprising continuity with practices still in use today. Chamomile tea, warm milk, lavender oil, and valerian root remain common suggestions for insomnia. What has changed is not the remedies themselves, but the explanations. Instead of balancing humors, we speak of calming the nervous system or relaxing the body. The persistence of these practices suggests that even in their peculiarities, medieval physicians recognized truths about the human need for comfort, ritual, and gentleness before sleep. But one unresolved question remains. Did these remedies truly work? Or did they soothe because people believed in them? Was it the herb, the prayer, or the act of lying in a darkened room that brought sleep? The records do not say. They leave us with lists of recipes and instructions, but not with the dreams of those who followed them. The deeper you enter into the world of medieval sleep remedies, the more you see how medicine, culture, and belief intertwined. To a physician of the 13th or 14th century, sleeplessness was never a simple matter of nerves or distraction. It was a symptom of imbalance, a disturbance in the delicate harmony of the body and spirit. Every treatment was designed not only to induce rest but to restore order. The remedies were peculiar by modern standards, but to those who lived in a world where every aspect of health was linked to humors and divine will, they made sense. One of the most widely circulated sources of advice was the Tequinum Sanitatis, a medieval handbook of health translated from Arabic into Latin. This text, derived from the work of the Baghdad physician Ibn Butlan, offered detailed recommendations for diet, environment, and habits to ensure proper rest. For sleep specifically, it advised moderation in food and drink, avoidance of late-night discussions, and gentle massages with oils. It emphasized that sleep was a cooling process that balanced the heat of waking life. To force it through unnatural means was dangerous. Remedies, therefore, had to coax rather than command sleep. Herbalists in monasteries also contributed to the body of knowledge. Monks cultivated gardens filled with plants believed to aid sleep. Lavender was grown for its calming fragrance. Chamomile, with its delicate blossoms, was dried for teas. Valerian, a root with a strong smell, was prized for its sedative properties. Recipes for herbal syrups and infusions were copied into manuscripts, passed from one generation of healers to the next. Some instructions were practical. Steep the herbs in hot water, strain, and drink before bed. Others were elaborate. Combine herbs with honey and wine, boil, and let cool in the moonlight before consuming. The moonlight itself was thought to add potency. Stranger remedies coexisted with these herbal practices. Some physicians recommended placing slices of raw onion near the bed, believing the vapors would calm the mind. Others instructed that the heart of a roasted pigeon, eaten with wine, could promote deep sleep. A physician in southern France suggested writing specific psalms on parchment, washing the ink into water, and drinking it as a potion. These practices blur the boundary between medicine and magic, yet they were taken seriously by both patients and doctors. The social context also shaped remedies. Wealthier patients could afford imported herbs, fine wines, and elaborate treatments. For them, a physician might prescribe baths scented with rose petals or ointments of saffron and sandalwood. For peasants, advice was simpler. Avoid heavy suppers, keep the bed clean, and drink a warm broth before lying down. The remedies varied in extravagance, but the principle was the same. Sleep required order, calm, and balance. Physicians also warned about the dangers of too much sleep. Just as insomnia was harmful, excessive sleep was seen as a sign of laziness or illness. Manuals cautioned against sleeping during the day, claiming it filled the head with damp vapors. Afternoon naps were discouraged unless one was weak or ill. At night, it was advised to rise before sunrise, since sleeping too long was believed to dull the senses. Thus, remedies sought not only to encourage sleep but to regulate it, ensuring that it occurred at the right time and in the right measure. Environmental advice was particularly detailed. Physicians recommended that bedrooms face east, to allow morning light to enter. They insisted on proper ventilation, though not drafts, which were thought to disturb humors. Bedding should be clean, sheets changed often, and pillows filled with herbs like hops or lavender. Some texts even described the best sleeping positions. Sleeping on the right side was advised to aid digestion, while sleeping on the left was discouraged. To lie flat on the back risked disturbing dreams, while sleeping face down was considered unhealthy for the lungs. Each position reflected beliefs about the movement of humors through the body. Alongside these recommendations, there were superstitions tied to dreams. Since sleep was a time when visions came, remedies often aimed at shaping or controlling dreams. A patient troubled by nightmares might be told to place a piece of iron beneath the bed to ward off evil spirits. Others were instructed to wear amulets inscribed with protective charms. Physicians themselves did not always endorse these practices, but they tolerated them, recognizing that fear of dreams was part of the experience of sleeplessness. Records of patients reveal how these remedies were applied. A woman in England, troubled by sleepless nights, was advised to drink a mixture of warm milk, honey, and nutmeg, then recite a prayer to the Virgin Mary before bed. A man in Italy suffering from chronic insomnia was given a syrup of lettuce juice and poppy seeds, to be taken at dusk. In both cases, the remedies combined the physical and spiritual, blending comfort, ritual, and belief. Yet, despite the variety of remedies, the results were uncertain. Medieval physicians acknowledged that some patients remained sleepless despite treatment. In such cases, they attributed the condition to deeper imbalances, perhaps melancholy or divine trial. Sleeplessness, like illness itself, was never entirely under human control. Remedies could help, but rest ultimately came from a harmony that might lie beyond reach. What these remedies reveal most clearly is the medieval understanding of health as a whole system. Sleep was not an isolated function but part of a balance involving food, drink, environment, spirit, and community. To treat insomnia, one adjusted every aspect of life. To eat lightly, to drink a calming infusion, to sleep in a clean and quiet room, to pray. All were parts of a single effort to restore order. Still, a question lingers. How much of these peculiar remedies worked through their ingredients, and how much through the comfort of ritual? Did the herbs truly calm the body, or did the patient's belief in their power bring sleep? The answer is uncertain, hidden in the silence of centuries. What remains are the recipes, copied carefully in ink, waiting for us to wonder about the dreams they produced. The long list of medieval sleep remedies comes to a quiet conclusion with the recognition that they were not only treatments but reflections of how people in the Middle Ages understood their world. Each recipe, whether for a syrup of poppy seeds or an amulet tied around the neck, represented an attempt to bring order to something mysterious. Sleep itself was never entirely explained. Physicians described it as vapors rising or humors cooling. Theologians described it as a time when the soul moved beyond the body, and ordinary people experienced it as relief when it came and suffering when it did not. Remedies gave shape to these ideas, turning the invisible into something manageable. The practical remedies, warm milk, honey, lettuce, chamomile, remain familiar today. They remind us that medieval physicians, for all their peculiar reasoning, observed real connections between food, relaxation, and sleep. Modern science would later describe these in terms of digestion, hormones, and nervous systems, but the effect was much the same. A warm drink, a soothing herb, a clean bed, these comforts made rest possible. Their survival into modern use suggests that, in many cases, the old remedies worked. The more unusual practices, the frog's leg tied to the neck, the roasted pigeon's heart, the ink of psalms washed into water, speak to a different truth. They reveal how medicine was never separate from faith and symbolism. A patient who could not sleep did not simply want a chemical solution. He wanted reassurance that the disorder was understood and that protection was in place. Carrying a charm or reciting a prayer gave him a sense of safety. Sleep required surrender, and surrender came more easily when one felt guarded by ritual. The diversity of remedies also reflected the diversity of Europe itself. In Italy, with its access to imported spices, remedies often included saffron, cinnamon, or nutmeg. In Northern Europe, remedies relied more on local herbs, hops, chamomile, and dill. In Islamic Spain, physicians drew on Arabic texts, prescribing syrups of dates and honey alongside prayers in Arabic. The remedies changed with geography, but the principle of balancing humors and calming the spirit remained consistent. Within the manuscripts, physicians often warned patients not to expect quick cures. Sleeplessness was stubborn, a sign that something deeper was out of balance. Remedies had to be repeated, sometimes for weeks, and combined with changes in daily habits. Go to bed early, avoid arguments before sleep, do not drink heavily in the evening. These instructions echo modern sleep hygiene advice. What is striking is how much continuity exists across centuries, despite the differences in explanation. There is also evidence that remedies were tested in households before physicians ever wrote them down. Mothers brewed chamomile tea for restless children, farmers chewed lettuce after heavy meals, monks experimented with herbs from their gardens. Physicians often codified practices that were already common. The remedies became part of a shared cultural memory, repeated across generations even as their rationale shifted. But the remedies also reveal the anxieties of medieval people. Night was not simply a time of rest but a time of danger. Darkness meant vulnerability to thieves, spirits, and unseen illnesses. Sleeplessness could be frightening, leaving one awake in silence while the rest of the household slept. To lie awake was to feel exposed. Remedies provided not only physical comfort but psychological armor against the fears of night. To sip a syrup, to pray a psalm, to place an herb beneath the pillow. These were ways to transform night from threat into safety. The physicians themselves, though dedicated to humoral theory, must have known that not every patient slept soundly after their prescriptions. Some no doubt realized that the act of care was as important as the remedy itself. To sit with a patient, to write out instructions, to give hope. These were forms of healing even when the sleep did not come quickly. The peculiar remedies worked not only through their ingredients but through the ritual of being treated. In reflecting on these practices, you can see that medieval sleep medicine was less about precise cures and more about managing uncertainty. It was about giving structure to restlessness, about providing small steps toward balance. In that sense, it was successful. Patients who followed instructions, who drank their teas and said their prayers, at least felt that they were doing something to regain rest. Whether sleep followed or not, the sense of order returned. Today, when people brew chamomile tea, light lavender candles, or listen to soft prayers before bed, they continue the same traditions. The science has changed, but the rituals remain. Sleep still requires comfort, still requires surrender, and people still reach for small remedies to help them cross into it. The medieval physicians, in their peculiar way, were not so far from us. But one question lingers. Did those who drank their syrups and placed their herbs beneath their pillows ever wonder, as we do, whether it was the remedy itself that brought sleep or the belief that it would? The answer is lost in the quiet of centuries, in the dreams that came or failed to come after those peculiar remedies were tried. The quiet jobs of Byzantine palace launderers. The Byzantine Empire, centered in Constantinople, thrived for more than 1,000 years. Much of its memory is filled with emperors, theologians, generals, and wars. Yet behind the grandeur of mosaics and the solemnity of councils were countless ordinary workers whose names never appeared in chronicles. Among them were the palace launderers, men and women tasked with one of the least glamorous yet most necessary jobs in the imperial household. Their work was quiet, repetitive, and invisible, but without it the palace could not function. Clean garments for courtiers, robes for clerics, linens for banquets, and uniforms for guards, all passed through their hands. To imagine their world, you must first picture the palace complex itself. The great palace of Constantinople stretched along the Sea of Marmara, a vast network of halls, courtyards, gardens, and service quarters. While the emperor held audiences in gilded chambers and processions dazzled the people, the hidden corridors of the palace hummed with activity from servants and artisans. In one corner were the laundries, where tubs, cauldrons, and drying racks stood ready for endless cycles of washing. The smell of soap mixed with steam, the sound of splashing water echoed against stone walls, and the launderers bent to their work. Their tasks began with collection. Palace attendants brought heaps of clothing, bedding, and linens from every part of the complex. These might include silk robes embroidered with gold thread, woolen garments worn by guards, altar cloths from the chapel, or the fine tablecloths used in banquets. Each item had to be sorted carefully. Silk required different treatment than wool. Stained cloth had to be treated separately from lightly soiled linens. The launderers knew these distinctions by experience, for mistakes could ruin valuable fabrics. The washing itself required physical strength. Large tubs were filled with water, carried from cisterns or drawn from aqueduct-fed basins. Into the water went soapwort, ashes, or imported soap made from olive oil. Garments were soaked, beaten against wooden boards, scrubbed with brushes, and rinsed repeatedly. Steam rose from cauldrons where especially soiled linens were boiled. The work left hands raw, arms sore, and backs aching. Yet it was steady work, performed day after day without pause. Drying was another challenge. In Constantinople's humid climate, garments could not simply be left in damp heaps. They were hung in courtyards, draped across ropes, or laid on heated stones to dry. Launderers watched the skies anxiously, for sudden rain could undo hours of effort. Once dry, garments were pressed and folded. Some were perfumed with herbs such as rosemary or lavender, meant to mask the odors of storage. Others were brushed to restore their sheen. Every robe returned to the palace had to appear spotless, for the image of the emperor and his court rested on appearances as much as on power. The launderers themselves lived modest lives. They were paid wages from the imperial treasury, but their names rarely appear in records. Occasionally, lists of palace staff mention groups of washerwomen or male attendants assigned to the laundries, but without detail. They were part of the background, expected to serve but never to be seen. Their social status was low, yet their labor was essential. For a palace that staged daily ceremonies of splendor, dirty linens or stained robes would have been unthinkable. The monotony of the work shaped their days. They rose early, often before dawn, to prepare water and supplies. The morning was filled with washing, the afternoon with drying and folding, the evening with deliveries back to various departments of the palace. Meals were simple: bread, cheese, olives, eaten quickly in between tasks. By nightfall, they were exhausted, their bodies carrying the wear of physical labor. Yet the next day began the same way, a cycle as endless as the tides. Despite its dullness, their work touched every layer of palace life. When an emperor dressed in silk robes to greet foreign envoys, it was the launderers who had washed and prepared those garments. When clerics processed into the chapel wearing clean vestments, the launderers had ensured they were spotless. When banquet tables glittered with fine cloths, the launderers had boiled and pressed them. Invisibility was their paradox. The more they succeeded, the less they were noticed. The Byzantine world valued hierarchy, and even in the laundries this was visible. Senior launderers supervised juniors, assigning tasks and monitoring quality. Women often handled lighter fabrics and linens, while men managed the heavy cauldrons and water hauling. Apprentices learned by watching, slowly gaining skill until they could take on more delicate work. Discipline was strict, for waste or damage could bring punishment. Cloth was costly, and mistakes were not tolerated. In rare cases, launderers entered records because of scandal. A Byzantine chronicle notes an incident where palace servants, including launderers, were accused of stealing scraps of silk. Another record mentions that launderers were sometimes suspected of passing messages or smuggling items in bundles of linens. The proximity of their work to the emperor's household gave them unusual access, though they remained at the lowest rung of palace society. Still, for most, life passed in steady cycles of work and rest. They lived in modest quarters near the palace, shared meals in communal kitchens, and formed close bonds with fellow workers. Their children often inherited the same roles, continuing the family trade. Over generations, the laundries became part of the hidden infrastructure of the empire, as enduring as the mosaics and walls that still survive. And yet, a question lingers at the end of this quiet picture. Did the palace launderers, bent over steaming tubs, ever think of the splendor their work supported? Did they take pride in knowing that their hands helped clothe emperors, or did they feel only the weight of endless toil? History preserves no answer, leaving only the sound of water splashing and the image of garments drying in the sun. The daily rhythm of the palace launderers did not vary much across years or even decades. What they performed was not extraordinary but routine, and it was this very routine that allowed the Byzantine court to appear as ordered and magnificent as it did. Behind every ceremony, banquet, or procession was the hidden work of people who never appeared in chronicles, but who ensured that the empire looked impeccable. The launderers were part of this invisible machinery. The Byzantine court valued ceremony above almost everything. From the coronation of emperors to the reception of ambassadors, the empire communicated its power through appearances. Clothing had to gleam, banners had to shine, altar cloths had to be spotless. In such a system, the launderers carried a responsibility that extended beyond clean linens. Their work was part of the empire's image, a detail in the theater of power. A stained robe could embarrass an emperor before foreign envoys, while unwashed linens in a banquet hall could suggest disorder in a court obsessed with ritual precision. The laundries themselves were busy places. Imagine entering one of these service quarters. Large tubs filled with water sat against stone walls, steam rising from cauldrons where fabrics boiled with ashes or soapwort. The air smelled of lye and damp cloth. Men carried buckets of water from cisterns, their arms wet to the elbow, while women bent over garments, scrubbing them with brushes or beating them against smooth stones. Apprentices fetched firewood, stirred vats, or carried drying cloths into courtyards. The sound of splashing, scrubbing, and wringing filled the space, a steady noise that rarely ceased. The substances they used were harsh. Soap, when available, was expensive, imported in blocks from regions such as Syria. More often, they used mixtures of ashes, clay, and water. Soapwort, a plant that produced a foamy solution, was also employed. These cleaners were effective but rough on the hands. Launderers worked with raw, cracked skin, sometimes wrapping their fingers with cloth to protect them. Injuries were common: burns from boiling water, cuts from handling heavy cloth, and back pain from lifting wet loads. Despite these hardships, they developed skill. They knew how to treat silk without damaging its delicate weave, how to whiten linens with sun and chalk, how to press wool so that it returned to shape without shrinking. Knowledge passed orally from older workers to apprentices, creating an informal tradition of expertise. Their techniques were practical science, refined through trial and error. Mistakes were costly. A ruined robe or damaged altar cloth could mean not only financial loss but punishment for negligence. The organization of the laundries mirrored the bureaucracy of the empire. A supervisor, often called an overseer of linens, assigned duties and checked quality. Records were kept of garments received and returned. These were not elaborate ledgers like those of palace accountants, but simple tallies to prevent theft or loss. Even so, corruption was possible. Chronicles suggest that some servants occasionally kept scraps of fabric or sold damaged items for profit. Such cases were punished harshly, for palace property was sacred to imperial dignity. Life in the laundries also reflected the larger social order of Byzantium. Many of the workers were from humble backgrounds, drawn from families who had long served the palace. Others were freed slaves or captives integrated into service. Women formed a large part of the workforce, especially in tasks involving lighter fabrics, while men carried out the heavier labor of hauling water and stoking fires. The work was communal, with families sometimes tied to the same trade for generations. Meals were plain and quick. Bread, cheese, olives, and sometimes beans formed the staples, eaten in short pauses between work. During major feasts, surplus food from the palace kitchens was sometimes distributed among staff, including launderers, giving them rare access to richer fare, roast meats, honeyed pastries, or fruits. These moments were small rewards in a life otherwise marked by repetition. And yet, despite their lowly position, the launderers touched the highest levels of the empire indirectly. When the emperor walked in procession clad in gleaming robes, their work was present. When priests celebrated liturgy over spotless altar cloths, their hands had prepared them. When dignitaries dined on tables spread with white linen, the launderers' efforts framed the meal. They were never in the spotlight, but without them, the spotlight itself would have faltered. Occasionally, historical records bring them into faint focus. An imperial edict mentions laundresses among the categories of palace staff entitled to rations. Another document lists punishments for servants caught damaging palace property, including those who mishandled linens. A Byzantine satirist even mocked palace workers for their endless scrubbing, suggesting that while emperors argued over theology, their servants drowned in soap and water. These glimpses remind us that though silent in chronicles, launderers were noticed when they failed, not when they succeeded. The monotony of their work invites reflection. To spend a lifetime washing, drying, and folding seems tedious, yet for many it was stability. Palace service offered regular wages, food allowances, and housing, things not always guaranteed in the uncertain economy outside. For families, employment in the palace laundries meant security, even if it came at the cost of anonymity. The empire's power rested not only on generals and emperors, but on these quiet workers who ensured that everyday needs were met. Still, the question remains: did the launderers see their work as drudgery or as service to something greater? Did they feel pride when they saw the emperor robed in garments they had cleaned, or did they notice only their aching hands and weary backs? The sources are silent. All we have is the knowledge that their work continued, day after day, century after century, supporting an empire that could not have functioned without them. The closing view of the palace launderers is not dramatic but steady, much like their work itself. Their labor never produced monuments or chronicles, but it preserved the dignity of the Byzantine court. The endless cycle of washing and drying, of folding and returning, was as essential to the empire's daily operation as the chants of the Hagia Sophia or the decrees of emperors. Without clean garments and linens, the ceremonies of Byzantium would have faltered. The importance of appearances in Byzantine culture cannot be overstated. The empire projected authority through elaborate rituals. Every robe had symbolic meaning: purple garments for the emperor, richly embroidered vestments for priests, uniforms for guards. These clothes were not only garments but instruments of power, visible signs of order and hierarchy. By keeping them spotless, the launderers maintained the empire's ability to stage its identity before both subjects and foreigners. A single stained robe at a coronation could undermine the spectacle, and so the laundries carried an invisible weight of responsibility. It is possible to imagine the final stage of their work. Clean robes, folded and perfumed with rosemary or lavender, were delivered to wardrobe keepers. Linens, whitened under the sun, were stacked neatly for kitchens or chapels. The launderers themselves faded back into their quarters. Unseen as the garments they had washed entered the public eye, the emperor appeared magnificent, the priests solemn, the courtiers dignified, but the labor behind the scenes remained hidden. Their lives followed a rhythm tied to the palace calendar. Great feasts and holy days created sudden surges of work. Before Easter or Christmas, the laundries filled with vestments that had to be cleaned and prepared. After great banquets, tablecloths stained with wine and grease arrived in heaps. After ceremonies, embroidered garments heavy with sweat needed careful washing. The launderers worked longer hours during these times, knowing that the empire's splendor depended on their speed. When ceremonies ended, their own work remained unfinished, for garments still had to be dried, repaired, and folded. The laundry also reflected the fragility of fabrics themselves. Silk, imported from the East, was costly and delicate. Mistreatment could ruin a robe worth a fortune. Launderers learned techniques to clean silk gently, sometimes using vinegar rinses or powders of chalk. Linen was more durable, but it yellowed easily and required sun bleaching. Wool absorbed odors and had to be boiled to release them. Each fabric posed challenges, and each mistake could bring consequences. These skills were never recorded in formal manuals but were passed through practice, creating a body of knowledge that disappeared when the empire fell. The monotony of the work also shaped the launderers' social identity. They were palace servants, part of a hierarchy that included cooks, stable hands, guards, and scribes. Within this system, they ranked low, but their work was secure. The palace ensured their food and wages, and in times of famine or war, this security mattered. While peasants outside the city struggled, palace launderers continued their cycles of washing. Their lives were dull but stable, a trade-off many accepted. Sometimes, though, proximity to the palace brought risks. Servants, including launderers, were vulnerable to being drawn into intrigues. A launderer might overhear conversations or be asked to carry secret messages hidden in bundles of linens. Accusations of theft or espionage occasionally appear in records, reminding us that even the quietest jobs could intersect with politics. Still, these were exceptions. For most launderers, life passed without such drama, leaving no trace except the garments they handled. Byzantium endured for centuries because of such invisible labor. Emperors waged wars and theologians debated doctrine, but the empire's daily survival depended on food delivered, buildings repaired, and clothes cleaned. The palace laundries were one strand in this web, humble yet essential. They exemplify the truth that great civilizations are not sustained only by their rulers but by countless ordinary people whose work is never remembered. When the empire finally fell in 1453, the laundries likely fell silent with the rest of the palace. The Ottoman conquerors inherited the buildings, but the routines of Byzantine servants disappeared. The names of the launderers vanished completely, their centuries of labor reduced to silence. Yet their contribution lived on in the very fact that the empire had endured so long. Without their constant cycles of washing, the spectacle of Byzantium could not have been maintained. The story of the palace launderers ends, then, not with drama but with reflection. Their work reminds us that history is made not only in battles and councils but in the quiet, repetitive tasks that keep societies functioning. Every robe worn by an emperor, every linen spread at a banquet, every vestment on an altar passed through their hands. Their legacy is not in names but in the cleanliness and order they created. And one question remains: in our retelling of history, do we overlook too much of the labor that sustained it? Should we remember more often the men and women who bent over tubs of water, who scrubbed and wrung garments until their hands cracked, who gave shape to the magnificence of an empire by making sure it never appeared soiled? Forgotten fruits the Incas domesticated. The Inca Empire is often remembered for its monumental stonework, its road system, and its complex administration. Yet another aspect of its achievement lies not in stone but in soil. The Incas inherited and expanded a tradition of domesticating plants that thrived in the Andean highlands. Among these were fruits that rarely appear in modern diets, overshadowed by potatoes and maize. These forgotten fruits once played roles in nutrition, ritual, and daily life, sustaining communities spread across mountains and valleys. To recover their story is to rediscover the quiet agricultural genius of the Andes. Begin with the setting. The Andes are a landscape of extremes. Valleys rise sharply into snowy peaks, climates shift within miles, and soils vary from fertile terraces to rocky slopes. In this challenging environment, the Incas and their predecessors developed farming techniques suited to altitude and terrain. Terracing, irrigation canals, and crop rotation allowed them to cultivate a wide variety of plants. While potatoes, maize, and quinoa became staples, dozens of fruits also grew in orchards and fields, each adapted to particular microclimates. One such fruit was the lucuma, still eaten in Peru today but largely unknown elsewhere. Shaped like a small avocado, its green skin hides orange-yellow flesh that is sweet, dense, and slightly dry. In Inca times, lucuma was not only a food but a symbol of fertility. Archaeological remains show it depicted in pottery, often associated with life and regeneration. It was eaten fresh where available, but also dried into a powder that could be stored or mixed with maize flour. For messengers, soldiers, or travelers, lucuma powder was a lightweight source of energy, its sweetness valued on long journeys. Another fruit was the cherimoya, called by some later visitors the custard apple, for its creamy texture. Mark Twain, centuries after the fall of the Inca Empire, would describe cherimoya as the most delicious fruit known to man. For the Incas, it was cultivated in valleys with milder climates and carried up into the highlands through trade. Its soft flesh was eaten fresh, a treat compared to the harsher foods of the high plateaus. Cherimoya, like lucuma, appears in Inca iconography, suggesting it held a special place in ritual as well as diet. The pepino dulce, or sweet cucumber, was another fruit widely grown. It resembled a melon in flavor, with pale flesh and a refreshing taste. It could be eaten raw, added to stews, or dried. Its mild sweetness made it suitable for children and elders, and it thrived in Andean valleys where other fruits struggled. Pepino was valued for its adaptability. It could grow in varied soils, making it a reliable crop in uncertain climates. Then there was the tumbo, a relative of the passion fruit. Tumbo vines clung to trellises or spread across the ground, producing elongated yellow fruits with tart pulp. Tumbo juice was diluted into drinks, mixed with maize beer, or eaten fresh. It was both refreshing and symbolic, often used in offerings to deities connected with rain and fertility. Its tartness contrasted with the sweetness of lucuma and cherimoya, offering variety in diets that otherwise relied heavily on starches. The Inca did not treat fruits as luxuries but as part of a larger agricultural system. They organized orchards on terraces, planted according to altitude, and rotated crops to maintain fertility. Fruits were integrated into rituals, given as offerings in ceremonies, and stored in state warehouses. Dried or powdered, they could be transported long distances to feed soldiers or sustain laborers building roads and terraces. Their cultivation required careful planning, since fruits often demanded more delicate conditions than grains or tubers. Consider, too, the social dimension. Fruits were associated with festivals and hospitality. A bowl of cherimoya offered to a guest signaled generosity. Lucuma trees near villages became symbols of abundance. Tumbo juice was shared during ceremonies, strengthening communal bonds. While maize and potatoes sustained survival, fruits provided variety and joy, their flavors breaking the monotony of staple foods. In this way, they were woven into both practical and cultural life. Spanish chroniclers, arriving in the 16th century, noted these fruits but paid them little attention compared to gold, silver, and potatoes. Some described lucuma as bland, failing to appreciate its sweetness when dried. Others dismissed pepino as a curiosity. The conquest disrupted cultivation patterns as new crops and animals spread. Over time, some fruits survived in limited areas, while others faded into obscurity. Today, lucuma is still prized in Peruvian desserts, cherimoya appears in markets, and pepino is grown on small scales. Yet their role as staples of empire is forgotten. Archaeological evidence, however, reminds us of their importance. Seeds preserved in dry caves, images painted on ceramics, and descriptions in quipus and chronicles all point to a culture that valued fruits as much as grains. They may not have sustained armies the way potatoes did, but they enriched diets, shaped rituals, and symbolized fertility. Their absence from modern memory is a reminder that history often overlooks the ordinary foods that sustained empires. The question that lingers is this: how different would global diets be if these fruits had spread as widely as potatoes and maize? Would lucuma be as common in desserts as sugar? Would pepino rival melons in popularity? Would tumbo drinks fill shelves alongside orange juice? The answers remain speculative, but they remind us that history is shaped not only by conquest but by what foods survived it. The story of Inca fruits deepens when you look at how carefully they were managed within the empire's agricultural system. Unlike potatoes or maize, which dominated fields across vast areas, fruits required specific environments. They were tied to microclimates, to valleys with the right warmth, to terraces protected from frost. The Incas understood this, and their farmers worked to integrate fruits into broader systems of production and exchange. Lucuma, cherimoya, pepino dulce, and tumbo each thrived in particular conditions. Lucuma trees needed dry subtropical valleys, where irrigation brought just enough water to their roots. Cherimoya preferred cooler, mid-altitude climates, where nights were mild and days temperate. Pepino dulce grew in varied soils, but gave best yields where the ground was loose and well-drained. Tumbo vines required trellises or open slopes where they could sprawl, soaking up sunlight but shielded from frost. Farmers identified these needs and carved out niches for each fruit, arranging them alongside staple crops. Trade filled the gaps. The Inca road system, supported by messengers and llama caravans, moved fruits from valleys to highlands. Cherimoya grown in temperate valleys might be carried hundreds of kilometers to Cusco. Lucuma, dried into flour, traveled even farther. Tumbo juice, harder to transport, was consumed locally, but vines were cultivated wherever conditions allowed. Pepino, durable and light, moved easily between regions. These exchanges ensured that even communities in harsh altiplano zones could taste fruits from warmer valleys, a luxury turned into routine by the empire's logistics. Storage was critical. The calcas, or state storehouses, preserved dried fruits and powders alongside grains and tubers. Archaeological remains reveal traces of lucuma flour and dried pepino, preserved in sealed containers. Fruits in their fresh state spoiled quickly, but once dried or ground, they became long-lasting, ideal for transport and redistribution. Soldiers on campaigns, laborers building terraces, and chasquis running along mountain roads all drew energy from these foods. The empire's ability to preserve and distribute fruits turned them from fragile luxuries into reliable rations. But fruits were never only about sustenance. They carried symbolic and ritual weight. Lucuma, associated with fertility, appeared in myths and was offered in ceremonies linked to agricultural cycles. Cherimoya, creamy and sweet, was seen as a gift of abundance, often consumed during festivals. Tumbo's tart juice was tied to rain rituals, poured as offerings to mountain deities. Pepino, with its refreshing mildness, was associated with hospitality. To offer a guest fruit was to offer not only food but respect and generosity. These meanings added layers to their value. Spanish chroniclers often overlooked this. Obsessed with gold, silver, and potatoes, they dismissed fruits as curiosities. A few remarked on cherimoya's sweetness, but others described lucuma as dry or unappealing. What they missed was the cultural framework. To the Incas, these fruits were not incidental. They were woven into stories, ceremonies, and daily gestures of care. Their importance cannot be measured only by taste but by their role in sustaining identity and ritual. The disappearance of many of these fruits from global diets after the conquest reflects the disruption of that framework. Spanish colonists introduced new crops, wheat, barley, grapes, apples, citrus, that displaced native fruits. The systems of terrace farming and storage broke down, as did the redistribution networks. Without the state ensuring their cultivation and trade, some fruits declined. Lucuma survived, but mostly in local valleys. Pepino continued but never expanded beyond the Andes. Tumbo remained regional. Cherimoya, though admired by later Europeans, became a specialty rather than a staple. Modern agriculture has only partially recovered them. In Peru, lucuma is now celebrated in desserts and ice cream. Cherimoya is grown in small quantities and praised for its flavor. Pepino and tumbo are harder to find, known mainly in local markets. Yet their history reminds us of what was lost: an empire-wide system where fruits played daily and symbolic roles. Their decline was not due to their qualities but to the collapse of the structures that sustained them. Imagine for a moment an Inca feast, Alongside roasted guinea pig and maize beer, bowls of fresh cherimoya and tumbo juice are set out. Lucuma flour is mixed into cakes sweetened with honey. Pepino slices are served to cool the mouth after spicy stews. Guests eat slowly, the fruits balancing heavier foods, the flavors marking the occasion as festive. To them, these fruits are not exotic. They are familiar, reminders of valleys, terraces, and orchards tended by their ancestors. What is striking is how these foods, forgotten in much of the world, still linger in Andean memory. Farmers still grow lucuma and pepino, still chew tumbo pulp, still pass cherimoya trees from one generation to the next. The empire that organized their production is gone, but the fruits survive in local traditions. In this continuity lies resilience. The forgotten fruits are not entirely lost. They are simply waiting, quiet in valleys, for recognition again. But one unresolved thought remains. If these fruits had spread globally after the conquest, as potatoes and maize did, how different would diets look today? Would lucuma flavor cakes in Europe? Would tumbo juice rival citrus drinks? Would pepino fill supermarket shelves beside melons? History chose another path, but the question lingers, reminding us how fragile the line is between memory and loss. To conclude the story of Inca fruits, it is necessary to see them not as isolated curiosities but as part of a larger pattern. The way food shapes identity and continuity. For the Incas, fruits such as lucuma, cherimoya, pepino dulce, and tumbo were woven into everyday diets and ritual life. They were not extravagances but threads in the fabric of empire, sustaining both body and spirit. Their cultivation, preservation, and symbolic use reveal how an empire thought about abundance, fertility, and the sharing of life. Consider lucuma once more. In Inca iconography, it often appeared in fertility symbols. Its tree was steady and long-lived, producing fruit year after year. Lucuma flour, stored in calcas, provided sweetness to a diet otherwise dominated by starches. For children, lucuma was a treat. For adults, it was a symbol of continuity. Its survival into modern Peru, where it flavors ice cream and cakes, shows how deeply it remained in cultural memory. Though the empire collapsed, lucuma endured as a taste of heritage. Cherimoya carried another meaning. Its soft, creamy flesh was rare in a land where much food was dense and dry. To bite into a cherimoya was to taste delicacy, a reward often reserved for feasts or honored guests. The Spanish later admired it, but without the Inca network of cultivation and trade, it became scattered, known but never central. In Inca times, however, cherimoya was a fruit of connection, linking valleys to highlands, carried in baskets along mountain roads to enrich diets at the center of empire. Pepino dulce offered reliability. Its pale flesh was mild, refreshing, and easy to digest. Elders valued it for comfort, children for sweetness. Farmers grew it in diverse soils, a symbol of adaptability in a land of extremes. Its presence on tables reflected stability, the promise that food would not fail even in difficult seasons. The fact that pepino survives quietly in Andean villages today mirrors its role in the past, never the star, but always dependable. Tumbo, tart and bright, represented energy and rain. Its vines spread across trellises and walls, producing fruit that could refresh or be turned into drinks. In rituals, tumbo juice was poured as offerings to mountain gods, linking its tang to the power of storms and fertility. To drink tumbo was not only to refresh the body but to participate in a cycle of giving and receiving with the land. Even today, in Andean households, tumbo juice remains tied to this sense of nature's rhythm. The larger picture shows how the Incas, through their fruits, created diversity within stability. Their diet was based on staples, but fruits gave color, flavor, and ritual depth. They were reminders that survival was not enough, that abundance and sweetness mattered, too. In this sense, the fruits embodied the empire's philosophy. Order balanced with joy, practicality joined with ceremony. After the Spanish conquest, much of this system collapsed. Crops like wheat, grapes, and citrus spread rapidly, while native fruits lost ground. Some endured in valleys, but their empire-wide significance disappeared. Lucuma survived in cultural memory. Cherimoya gained praise but little spread. Pepino remained local, and tumbo persisted mainly in Andean households. What was once ordinary became rare, remembered only by those who kept the traditions alive. Yet archaeology ensures that their story is not lost. Seeds preserved in storage pits, drawings on ceramics, and references in chronicles reveal the role they played. Scholars studying residues in Calcas confirm that dried lucuma and pepino were stored for state use. Texts describe fruits given as offerings in ceremonies. In these fragments, the outlines of a vanished system emerge again. To reflect on this is to see how fragile food histories can be. The global diet today might have included lucuma cakes, pepino salads, and tumbo juices alongside potatoes and maize. Instead, history chose other staples to spread. The forgotten fruits remind us of the accidents of history, of how conquest, trade, and preference shaped what endured. And yet, their survival in Andean culture carries meaning. Farmers who still tend lucuma trees, families who still drink tumbo juice, and markets that still sell cherimoya are preserving not just foods but memories. Each fruit is a quiet continuity with the empire that once organized valleys and mountains into a network of abundance. So the final reflection is this: the forgotten fruits of the Incas show that history is not only about monuments and conquests but about what people ate, what they offered, what they cherished. They remind us that sweetness, fertility, and hospitality mattered as much as strategy and war. Their disappearance from global diets is a loss, but their endurance in local memory is a victory of resilience. And the unresolved question remains: if global history had taken a different turn, would lucuma, cherimoya, pepino, and tumbo be as common in the world today as apples and oranges? The silence of history leaves no answer, but the fruits themselves, still alive in Andean soil, whisper possibilities of what might have been.